Good morning and welcome to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. That's good morning to those of you on the East Coast, and good afternoon and good evening to those of you watching in other parts of the world. Uh, Last week, without question, represented a significant change in US policy towards Syria when President Trump and the new transitional government from Damascus, President Ahmed al-Sharaa, met in Saudi Arabia. Together with that meeting, President Trump announced his intent to suspend US sanctions toward the country. In return, he urged Syria's transitional government to take several key steps: sign the Abraham Accords and normalize relations with Israel, eject foreign fighters from Syria, deport Palestinian terrorists, help prevent an ISIS resurgence, and take over detention facilities currently housing ISIS detainees. This requires significant work on part of the new authorities in Damascus, and implementing sanctions relief and all of the steps that will follow will require significant work and changes in US policy here in Washington, D.C. Without question, this is a moment of significant opportunity as well as significant risk. So the Washington Institute is pleased to convene today's policy forum with several of our in-house experts to dive deep into all of the issues relating to unpacking this policy change and the challenges of implementing it. Matthew Levitt is the Fromer Wexler Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute and director of its Jeanette and Eli Reinhard program on counterterrorism and intelligence. Matt previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the U.S. Department of the Treasury and a State Department counterterrorism advisor to the Special Envoy for Middle East Regional Security. Devorah Margolin is the Blumenstein Rosenblum Senior Fellow here at the Washington Institute and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. She previously served as Director of Strategic Initiatives and a senior fellow at the Program on Extremism at the George Washington University. Sohair Medini is a visiting fellow here at the Washington Institute, currently in residence from the French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs. She's a career diplomat and spent time in Algeria and in Egypt. Finally, David Schenker is the Toby Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute and director of the Linda and Tony Rubin Program on Arab Politics. He previously served as the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs and at the Department of Defense. Before we dive into today's questions, a few housekeeping notes. If you would like to ask questions of our panelists during the event, please enter them into the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you are watching this policy forum on our website or on YouTube, you can email your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Again, policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. As you think about your questions, let's get right into the substance of today's conversations. David, I'm going to turn to you first and ask you to set the policy table for our discussion today. What did we just see in Saudi Arabia last week with this meeting between Presidents Trump and Sharaa? Is this a pivot in U.S. policy?
Thanks, Dana. And it's a pleasure to be with you and my colleagues today. Yeah, this is a remarkable change, 180 degrees from the policy that was essentially in place for the Trump administration. Not only did President Trump meet with Ahmed al-Sharaa, previously designated terrorist, but he also, at the encouragement of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and Turkish President Erdogan, decided to lift the raft of sanctions that had been in place against Syria starting in 1979, but building over the years based on Syria's, I think, pernicious and regionally destabilizing behavior. Let me sort of go into some detail about this. I mean, I think it came as quite a surprise, the lifting of sanctions. It had certainly been the highest level meeting from a U.S. government official. I think Barbara Leaf, the former assistant secretary, had met with them, but this raised up the ante quite a bit. But it came as a surprise, I think, the lifting of sanctions. But it probably shouldn't have come as a surprise. President Trump is predictably unpredictable. He routinely makes shocking policy announcements, which come as a surprise, seemingly to some of his closest advisors. Think the Gaza Riviera. The sudden suspension of sanctions was, for me, I think, quite reminiscent of Trump's December 2018 decision to withdraw all troops from Syria. At the time, that too was a complete reversal of the policy. It was also a decision taken immediately in the aftermath of a phone call between Trump and Turkish President Erdogan. Now, prior to the visit, U.S. policy had been to condition any sanctions relief in Syria on the al-Shara's government's accomplishment of 8 particular tasks. I'm not going to go through them all, but they included fighting ISIS, securing al-Hol, which I'm sure Dev will talk about, and repatriating prisoners, investigating the fate of Austin Tice, denying Palestinian terrorist groups sanctuary in Syria, preventing Iranian military from reestablishing a presence. But most importantly, the rooting out of foreign fighters and designated terrorists from the ranks of the new Syrian army. These undoubtedly remain U.S. objectives in Syria, even in the aftermath of the lifting of the sanctions. But the leverage to compel the regime or the government to take these steps are largely gone. Trump said in Riyadh, of course, that the decision to suspend sanctions came about after talks with MBS and Erdogan, who thought that the lifting of sanctions and these measures would give al-Sharaa and Syria a chance to succeed. This is, I think, clear evidence not only of President Erdogan's influence with Trump, but also that of Mohammed bin Salman. It's a big win for the two, and two of the most important leaders in the region. Erdogan's Turkey had been a big player in Syria for nearly a decade and a half, occupying broad swaths of Syrian territory and sponsoring one of the largest Sunni militias still in the country, the Syrian National Army, or SNA, which was pivotal in toppling the Assad regime. Mohammed bin Salman wants Saudi to be a player in Syria, and now it will be able to influence the trajectory of events on the ground through leveraging humanitarian support and reconstruction funding. It will also be able to better contest the burgeoning Turkish influence in this Arab state. The other Gulf Cooperation Council states are also quite pleased at this turn event. At the end of the day, though, I think, or I'd like to think, that the driving factor here is what Secretary of State Marco Rubio said just a day ago, that it was the assessment of the U.S. government that Syria was just weeks away from, quote unquote, potential collapse, absent some sort of significant sanctions relief.
Thank you so much for that. So, in sum, continuity is the surprise when it comes to Syria, or surprise is the continuity when it comes to Syria policy and President Trump. Key change is that prior to last week's meeting, sanctions relief was conditioned on certain actions. And the innovation of last week is the risk that some of the leverage is gone in terms of encouraging the kinds of actions the United States wants to see in Syria. And finally, this question of Turkey and Saudi, two U.S. key partners, whether competition or cooperation will be the rules of the road going forward. Much to unpack there in further discussion today. Devora, let's talk about the future of the Defeat ISIS campaign, which from now on I'm just going to call de-ISIS. It's been more than a decade that the United States has led this campaign. And one of the Trump asks, as we've already talked about, is taking over of the de-ISIS fight, and specifically the detention facilities, where there are still 9,000 ISIS fighters being held. So walk us through the significance and the expectations in President Trump's ask of Damascus and the new transitional government. Can Damascus take over this mission? Should we trust them to take over this mission?
Thank you, Dana, and thank you for having me here today. I'll start by saying, while the meeting between Trump and al-Sharaa was a surprise, I would say that the counter-ISIS mission as part of the conversation was not a surprise. U.S. counterterrorism policy aimed at the defeat of ISIS has been a central part of U.S. policy in Syria since 2014. And with partners on the ground, specifically the Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces, we saw the territorial defeat of the Islamic State in 2019. But that military defeat also led to one of the greatest unresolved challenges that we have seen in Syria, specifically the SDF's detention of tens of thousands of Islamic State affiliated men, women, and children from more than 60 different countries. And CENTCOM has realized that this threat has evolved over time. And in fact, they have reevaluated the threat and they divided into the IS insurgency, the IS detention centers, detention facilities, which do hold 9,000 adult men and teenage boys affiliated with the group. But this also includes the IS detention centers, Al Hol and Roj specifically, which hold just under 40,000 people now. And it is no secret that in his first administration, President Trump talked about removing troops from Syria. And for years, the CENTCOM assessment has been that if the US was to leave Syria and the SDF couldn't fight ISIS on their own, you would see prison breaks, radicalization in Al Hol, and a return of ISIS in just 1 or 2 years. But today, we're really looking at a different Syria. It's a drastically different Syria. There is no longer the Assad regime. We have a feeling of hope that perhaps the new Damascus administration can unify and stabilize Syria. But this also all comes at a time when the US is looking for a lighter footprint in the Middle East and has overhauled our foreign assistance program, including cutting or freezing very important funds for the detention of IS affiliated families in Al Hol and Roj, as well as the repatriation process. I also think we need to remember that the CTEF funds from DoD, which fund our ability to work by, with, and through local troops, are set to end in September of 2026. But that said, Damascus has taken steps to fighting ISIS, even using US intelligence to target the group. I think the important part of the ask that went out was to help the US fight ISIS, not take over fully, but help the US fight ISIS. And the idea here is that this would really alleviate some fears about al-Sharaa's former association with al-Qaeda and ISIS itself. But I think what's missing is a need to clarify Syria's approach, and also Syria's approach on the detention facilities and camps specifically, which have long been run by the Syrian Democratic Forces with US support. And the ultimate goal, according to the US across multiple administrations, has been the depopulation of these camps through repatriation. But that takes time, and we've seen a lot of political reluctance to do this. And in fact, the entire counter-ISIS mission takes time. It requires training, equipment, intelligence. And so I think when we think about the US asking Damascus to help in the fight and hand over the running of detention centers, there's a lot of important points we need to look at. We need to set expectations with Damascus. They cannot just open prison doors and let people loose. There needs to be a plan clarifying the financial gaps that need to be filled, especially as CTEF funding ends or USAID and State Department funding ends for these programs. There needs to be assurances of the secure and humane treatment of those detained, a clarification of who will aid Damascus in these new responsibilities, and most importantly, a clear timeline on this process. Like I said, the SDF has primarily taken this on. And so if Damascus is going to take this on, there needs to be a clear timeline on that handover. And this needs to be done with coordination from our regional partners. Otherwise, we risk an ISIS resurgence again. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So what I hear you saying is asking Damascus to help with this mission is completely consistent with the trajectory of US policy, but not so fast. Answer important questions first. Funding, training, equipment, expectations for Damascus, expectation for others who have been part of this mission, timeline, and how we work with partners. Key questions and implementation to think about going forward. Matt, let's turn to broader counterterrorism policy and implications given this change in approach to Syria. President Trump met with a designated terrorist last week. So catch us up in the story. Why was Sharaa designated in the first place? Are there implications to a US president meeting with a designated individual? And secondly, there has been a debate, at least in Washington, as to whether Sharaa can be trusted to credibly and inclusively govern Syria for all Syrians and keep it safe from the kinds of violent jihadi extremism we've seen take hold in Syria before. Can we trust him? Should we trust him? And when you, from a CT, a counterterrorism perspective, look at the accounting ledger on what he's done to date, what are the indicators that we can or cannot work with him?
All small, simple questions.
Special just for you.
It's a pleasure to be here, especially with these colleagues and friends. Appreciate it very much. Look, it is definitely unique to have a president sit with someone who is a sitting designated terrorist. He's also not the first U.S. official to meet with him. Ambassador Barbara Leaf, as the Assistant Secretary for the State Department, met with him towards the end of the Biden administration. And we're in new territory here. The government had indicated under Biden that they would be willing to remove his designation. As we wrote in a report here for the Washington Institute back in March, it's not the designations of any individuals or even the designations of any particular group like HTS, which al-Sharaa leads, that is the problem that we're facing in terms of the sanctions issue with Syria. We'll get to that later. For the moment, the counterterrorism issues are actually kind of complicated. It's not as simple as some officials have said that once a jihadi, always a jihadi. On the other hand, it's also the case that there's absolutely no room for trusting and verifying. There's just verifying. There can be no trust. Because we're talking about someone who was designated for being the head of an organization that was part of al-Qaeda, that grew out of the Islamic State, who was selected by al-Baghdadi to go to Syria and did break with these groups. And even as recently as this week, has been the subject of a fatwa where takfir has been declared against him by no one less significant than Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi. Sharaa and HTS have a 7-8 year track record of running things in Idlib and maybe not running them like a Jeffersonian democracy, but not carrying out acts that would typically be described as acts of international terrorism. Because of their history, because of the ties they still have to still designated persons and groups, some of whom have been given positions within the new Syrian government's military. One of the U.S. government demands is to remove these foreign fighters from the government, maybe give them a farm in Idlib and let them retire in happiness. The reality is that their history cannot be ignored. And on the flip side, this government has actually done some things that are really kind of useful and that I don't think people might have expected from a guy that used to be a hardcore Salafi jihadi. He has stopped weapons shipments going through Syria to Hezbollah. He has effectively kicked Iran out of Syria. The Iranians are still trying to find ways in, but so far they're failing. This arguably is Iran's Vietnam. Documents have been found that they wanted to have their own kind of USAID type of policy in Syria. Ironic, since we no longer have one. That they wanted this to be their own Marshall Plan. This huge investment in Syria has been lost to them. As recently as just this past week, when we have provided them information about ISIS plotting, they take that action. The Turks have said the same in terms of their ties to them, their provision of information about ISIS. So it really is a mixed bag. For me, the ultimate issue is, since there's no trusting and verifying, there's only verifying, what kind of leverage will we continue to have to make sure that this is just not someone saying the things that have to be said in the moment, recognizing that other jihadi groups weren't able to get as far as he's gone through traditional jihadi means, and as some have argued, try something different, a wolf in sheep's clothes to get past the hump of being able to take over Syria. How are we to convince people not to have Iran 1979 vibes, where right after the revolution, they included communists and they included secularists, and it took about a year until the new regime in Iran started killing these people? And the answer to me has to be leverage. The two most important things there tied to what Devorah was just saying in the first instance, is the US military presence, which to my mind is the exact way a military presence should be. Very, very small, very cost effective, very low risk to personnel, exponentially outsized impact on a whole bunch of different ways. Having some type of US presence there, I think, is going to be critical, including, as Devorah was talking about, for the issue of the al-Hol, al-Roj, and other camps. And the other, as I know we'll get to in more detail in a moment, so I'll just throw it out here and we can come back to it, Dana, when you're ready, is the issue of sanctions. It's not clear to me that what the president really wants is an actual termination of all sanctions. And if you listen to the State Department, if you listen to the Secretary of State yesterday, if you listen to what the U.S. Treasury Department has been saying since then, they're really talking more about ways to implement necessary authorizations so that investment can happen in Syria. But there's a real desire for there to be some ways to maintain some leverage, which I think will be really important.
These are such important points. No trust, only verify, maintain leverage, don't look at words, look at actions. Early actions by this government are promising in specific categories, but necessary to maintain leverage, to encourage the kinds of actions we need to be able to see on the US military presence. Important remaining leverage there. Do not move too fast. So, Hare, thinking about the capitals across Europe and how those governments and those leaders were watching the events in the Middle East last week as the United States announced this change in US approach to Syria. Prior to last week, Europe has actually been leading in many ways by convening donor conferences, meeting at a very high level with leaders of the new government in Damascus. So what is the view? What's the mood? What's the temperature from Europe? Does this open more opportunities for transatlantic cooperation on Syria?
Thank you very much, Dana. It's a great pleasure to be part of this panel today. Actually, the European countries have reacted positively to the evolution of the US position because from day one, they actually perceived the fall of al-Assad as a potential strategic and historic opportunity. So as a consequence, as you said, there is probably this greater transatlantic alignment probably opens new opportunities for closer cooperation. So I'll begin with what has been done since December 24, when the EU decided directly to step in, despite the lack of comprehensive consensus between the 27 member states. They were able to agree on several steps. One of them was, as you said, the engagement with the new authorities. Several EU ministers went to Damascus. The Syrian foreign minister himself took part to the Brussels 9th conference last March. They also announced sanctions relief last February, emphasizing at the time on the need to alleviate the humanitarian crisis. And then similar moves came from non-EU European countries such as Norway and UK. And actually, I would say that two main reasons explain what has been a quite consistent stance from the EU since December. The first one is that Syria's long civil war brought major consequences in Europe that included mass casualty terrorist attacks and over 1 million refugees. So in this context, the conviction was that without help to Syria post-Assad, there would be no other scenario than the one where the country descend back into chaos and provide haven for terrorists. Actually, more or less what Marco Rubio said yesterday, as David pointed out. So the idea was, let's give these new authorities the benefit of the doubt, while also verifying everything they say, but also everything they do. Second reason, which is important from an EU perspective, is Russia's war against Ukraine. And Europe obviously would like to seize this opportunity to diminish Syria's reliance on Russia, which is perceived as a country that was too happy weaponizing the desperate situation in Syria against Europe for the last decade. So The willingness of the US administration to also give a chance to this new Syria open opportunities, because for the EU looked to be leading the way in shaping the conversation, but at the same time, the EU needs the US to be on board as well. First, on sanctions. The EU relief, which is now a lifting, we could talk about that later on. It was an important step, especially symbolically. However, a US move is necessary to make this European dynamic both effective and more relevant. Because of the secondary and tertiary US sanctions, big European companies and banks would probably never take the risk of investing large scale in Syria. Second point of strong common interests is probably the destruction of the previous regime's chemical weapons program. So on this, both sides of the Atlantic should probably continue pushing together for a strong cooperation between Damascus and the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. A third area of common interest is the situation in Northeast Syria. We mentioned the ISIS fight before. Deborah did. So Northeast Syria, where France and the UK have been on the ground, is important. And the US, along with France, recently doubled down on pushing for a Damascus FDS deal. This certainly helped secure a first step agreement last March. However, this was just the beginning of the process, and the talks are still going on to settle the situation and unify both sides. And why this is key? Because such an agreement is necessary to figure out a US withdrawal from Northeast Syria that would be coordinated with the ISIS partners, but that will not have Afghanistan-like consequences. And maybe a last area of potential cooperation. It seems to me that from an American and European perspective, transitional justice must be a central part of the entire conversation, not as a principle, but to ensure progress towards reconciliation. This idea of reconstruction, but also reconciliation, to avoid violence, acts of revenge, as we've unfortunately seen the last months, and to help build a stable new Syria that will no longer pose a threat to the region.
Thank you so much for pointing out that in many ways, the European approach is consistent over time because of the focus on European security at home, from ISIS-directed and inspired attacks to the impact of taking in so many refugees from the Syrian civil war. So what we've seen in the change to the Sharaa government in Damascus is consistent that European thinking is engage in Syria in order to address security issues on the European continent. And then these very specific areas for future transatlantic cooperation, I think, are worth underscoring on securing and getting rid of the remaining chemical weapons stockpiles in Syria, on looking at the future of the de-ISIS fight in Northeast Syria specifically, and building on the announcement of a process between Damascus and the Syrian Democratic Forces in Syria, how to continue working through the implementation steps on that process of rapprochement and integration. Thank you so much to all of you for that excellent first round. We're going to go dive even deeper into the specifics of implementing and following up on President Trump's announcements from last week. So Matt, you are in the hot seat first. Let's talk about sanctions relief. Yes, there was an announcement last week, but now is when the hard work actually starts, implementing the president's direction. You already spoke about what his intent might be in terms of relief versus lifting. The Treasury Department has already made some initial announcements as to how it will implement the president's guidance. Secretary Rubio spoke about this in congressional testimony this week, but you wrote the paper on this prior to last week's announcements. So talk about how you would recommend the US government move forward. How should sanctions relief be implemented? And then, because you spoke earlier about retaining leverage, if the Sharaa government is going down the wrong path or taking certain actions that cause concern and consternation here in Washington, can sanctions be put back on?
Thanks, Dana. So we wrote this paper in March at a time when the administration was still holding a very hard line, saying there can be no sanctions relief of any kind. And we went from that position, complete whiplash, 0 to 60, to what sounded at first like a complete termination of sanctions, and then backpedaling by different officials and parts of government on how to do that short of completely terminating sanctions. And I think that that's really important to understand. It's not the case that for most of these sanctions, you can just flip a switch and turn it on, and turn it off, and turn it on, and turn it off at will. Some of these actually take a whole lot of work to do. And so you don't want to terminate them. If only out of a bureaucratic perspective, you want to be able to turn them back on if necessary. Some of them, arguably the most important and impactful sanction, the Caesar Act, is something that the president can't just terminate on his own. That was created by Congress, would require Congress to do it. But what he can do is, for a period of time, I think it's about 180 days, have a pause. Caesar is most important because it has mandatory secondary sanctions effect. There are other things looking over the horizon that would have to be dealt with that could also be technically a little bit complicated in terms of state sponsorship of terrorism. On the one hand, this is a different regime. This is not the Assad regime. On the other hand, one of the main concerns we have about this regime is the potential for it to not do enough and, at a minimum, tolerate the existence of terrorist groups in its soil. So the administration has asked for it to take action against ISIS. The administration has asked for it to take action against Palestinian terrorist groups present on Syrian soil. The Israelis, for their part, that's one of their biggest concerns coming after October 7th, concerned about threats across their borders. Hamas traditionally was headquartered in Damascus. Hamas and Turkey are very close today. Turkey is very dominant in Syria today. Will the al-Sharaa government have the political capital when he has pressure from the right over other more militant groups that have not yet integrated into the Ministry of Defense? Just today, he issued a 10-day window for these smaller groups, not the SDF, it appears, to integrate into the MOD. Will he be able to go out on a limb on Palestinian issues? And so I think that the disconnect between where we were when we wrote this paper in March and now is severe. And if I'm feeling it, I can tell you people in government are feeling it, because the experts who work on these issues in places like the State Department and the Treasury Department were not aware that the president was about to make the statement and are now trying to, frantically catch up and figure out what exactly did he mean and how to implement this. So I think in the moment, instead of talking about new ways to address the general license, which I wrote about in great detail before, that's definitely yesterday's news. We're not talking about simply expanding or extending the general license. Things that weren't covered under the general license that would have still been a problem seem now to be in the process of being fixed, such as reconnecting Syrian banks to SWIFT for international bank transfers. I personally do believe that we still need some type of system to be able to observe what's happening within the banking system in Syria, which historically has been a problem, and over the past few years has become less developed at anti-money laundering and counter-terror financing capabilities. But it actually truly was the case that we were all looking for ways to reconnect at least certain Syrian banks to the international financial system, because Syria was getting to the point where they were trying to decide, are we going to try and get what aid we can get in, what reconstruction money we can get in by Hawaladar, by money exchange houses? Are we going to try and truck it in on trucks of pallets of cash from Jordan? Neither of which were attractive options. And so now it does look like we're beyond that. Again, I think the most important thing, the thing that really was, as David said, so close to putting the death knell in this post-Assad political experiment, was the state level sanctions. And so if people want to be able to send a message that we're doing something by delisting certain individuals, by delisting certain groups, that's fine. That's not what's actually going to enable money to move. For that, we're going to have to deal with state level sanctions regimes. And some of that's going to require congressional action. And what I hope is that all of it's going to be done in such a way that things are suspended. I'm not going to use the terms licenses and waivers because that's what we've been using until now in ways that really didn't have any real effect. So they become kind of tainted terms for our European colleagues and for the Syrians, and for good reason. They're not wrong. But suspension as opposed to termination of sanctions, I think, is going to be really important.
Such important things that I heard you say in terms of how we move forward. One is, in general, the importance of coordinating across the government in advance of presidential announcements so that those implementing them actually understand the intent and how to do it. And your observation that we are well beyond timelines for general license extensions here. We're now talking about facilitating banking, connecting Syrian banks back to the international system, the importance of lifting the state level sanctions, and not so fast. The president cannot do it only within his executive authority, because some of the sanctions on Syria have been done through executive action, i.e. the White House, and others have been done by Congress, which means legislative, which means congressional action. And as we all know, that does not happen fast. So stay tuned in this space. So Hare, yesterday, in addition to what Matt just laid out about the action and the contemplation that's happening here in Washington, D.C., the EU announced a political decision to lift economic sanctions on Syria. In its statement announcing the decision, the Council said it wants the Syrian people to have the chance to reunite and rebuild a new, inclusive, pluralistic, and peaceful Syria free from harmful interference. It's a tall order. There also appears to be some nuance in the EU announcement because it spoke about lifting economic sanctions, but keeping in place other sanctions on arms and technology that could be used for internal repression and against human rights violators. So talk to us about what happens in terms of EU implementation of this policy.
Thank you very much, Dina. Actually, the way this statement was framed, I think reflects what has been the European approach, which is basically trust and verify. So the trust part is lifting sanctions, verify is the rest. To go back first to the timing of this decision, what I think is that the US move definitely accelerated, which was an EU trend. As I mentioned before, Europe began its process of sanctions relief back in February and took then a first step on key Syrian economic sectors. It seems, however, that the sea change in US policy made us go from relief to lifting, and it's probably not by chance. If the EU announced yesterday, 1 week after Donald Trump's declaration, the political decision to lift its economic sanctions. But as you said, the framing is broad, and it's maybe too early to see how it will translate into reality. Starting from next week, we'll see from Brussels coming the technical implementations, and then we'll see exactly how this implementation is framed. But however, this undeniably constitutes a ramp up in terms of engagement and sanctions relief. So what is interesting here is that the US move helped strengthen the consensus inside the EU, where some watchful countries consider that the EU should be cautious and manage its engagement. And actually, we've seen this skepticism expressed a few weeks ago during key visit of al-Sharaa in Paris, which was an important visit because it was the first in the West and to a permanent member of the Security Council. But after the US declaration, the idea was if Donald Trump himself, who said back in December that the United States should have nothing to do with Syria, is now ready to get involved, maybe it's worth a try, and maybe trust should go from lifting lifting sanctions. And second, on the approach, I think it has always been trust and verify, officially called gradual and reversible approach. And from an European perspective, here is the leverage, is the fact that this approach is reversible, meaning the EU was ready to extend the hand to Syria, but now the onus is on Damascus to prove its willingness to truly build a new Syria and take the right decisions. And then these sanctions could be reimposed if the situation deteriorates. And as you mentioned, the EU statement is also announced human rights violators, sanctions against human rights violators and those fueling instability in Syria, which to me certainly refers to the events in the coast last March and other events afterwards. And the aim is probably to highlight EU willingness to monitor developments on the grounds, that we're still watching what's happening. We didn't stop watching what's happening in Syria last December, and that the EU is ready to react accordingly. But these new sanctions are not actually Syria-related sanctions. They are human rights sanctions. It's another regime. So the idea is trust for this new Syria, but verifying for what's happening. And your last question on the focus, maybe it's too early to know in which areas the European countries will be focusing. Nevertheless, I think we should expect a contribution now not only to alleviating the suffering of Syrians, but also in coordination with regional powers to help rebuild Syria, which is exactly what the EU, alongside the United States, refused to do as long as al-Assad was in power. And this is also the trust part of the approach.
Fascinating. So Matt says the US approach is no trust, only verify. Sohair says the European approach is verify with some trust. That the US move last week accelerated European action and strengthened consensus about how to move forward on engaging with Syria. Next week in Brussels, with the technical committee convening, is the time to watch how this will be implemented and described, I think, in a very clear way, the European approach to sanctions relief, which is gradual and reversible, with a focus on how to retain the ability to reimpose sanctions. So in some ways, I think the United States here should be watching how the European governments are doing and taking a nod on the reversibility, the incremental approach, and then again, retaining the space to reimpose should behavior or actions be going in the wrong direction, which would be detrimental to Syrians' stability, the rest of the region, as well as have serious impacts, I would say, on both European and American security. Devora, let's go back to setting expectations with Damascus. As part of this help that was requested from Damascus to take over the de-ISIS mission set, can you talk about the other stakeholders and actors with whom we need to also set expectations? This isn't only about what Damascus does, it's about what others do in terms of the implementation of this vision. So talk to us about what else needs to happen.
Thank you. I think that's a really great question, because thinking about this issue within the isolation of just Damascus, it is missing a large part of the picture, and especially about the last, almost 10 plus years since the civil war began, which is that Syria is a divided country and has been. It has several areas of influence, including former Assad-held areas with Russian and Iranian influence, Turkish influence, the Northeast, where the SDF has been operating with the support of the United States, as well as on the ground, as Sohair mentioned, UK and French forces as well. And so there are a lot of different actors that are part of this conversation. And while the US has shouldered the bulk of the military force, the financial responsibility for the counter-ISIS mission in Syria, the first few months of President Trump's presidency and his reluctance to clarify a policy on Syria really allowed for many international actors to push their own agenda. From Damascus itself to the SDF trying to expand the territory into former regime areas, to Turkey pushing down into SDF areas, or even our European partners who've taken the lead on trying to clarify the counter-ISIS mission. And so what the United States needs to do is they really need to find a balance between these international actors and the best interest of the counter-ISIS mission. I will just say specifically for Damascus, the US needs to clarify if they actually want to take on the entirety of the counter-ISIS mission, right? They have expressed an interest and ability to help fight ISIS, but the taking on of the detention facilities and the detention camps is a very different ballgame. And that's at a time where, as we talked about, the Syrian government is trying to deal with the horrible humanitarian crisis that's happening across Syria. And so it might not even be in their desire. The second issue is the SDF Damascus issue. There have, at US encouragement, at European encouragement, the SDF conversations with Damascus have begun, but they have not proceeded as quickly as we have hoped. I think partially because Damascus doesn't feel the pressure to proceed on these conversations, while the SDF is trying to use its relationship, its longstanding position as ally and partner on the ground with the US and the holding of the detention centers, which it sees as both a burden as well as a negotiating tool and a financial tool that has helped finance its operations. But all of this to be said that this is all happening as US aid and State Department funding is coming to an end, and that is how the detention camps specifically have been funded primarily by US aid and State Department, as well as DoD's CTEF funding is ending in 2026. And that's how we have funded our operations in partnership with the SDF against the insurgency, as well as the prisons. So Washington and its allies really need to encourage the SDF to engage with Damascus, while also encouraging Damascus to acknowledge the military training and experience that the SDF has in this counter-ISIS mission. And that can't be underestimated. Another important actor we need to consider is Turkey. Turkey has its own agenda, and that's primarily drawn by both its domestic and a foreign policy situation against the PKK. And that worries, Turkey's influence in Syria worries Damascus, it worries the region, it worries the international community. In fact, this week we are seeing US and Turkey convening here in DC for the Syria Working Group. And so steps are being taken to kind of negotiate this relationship, but Washington needs to ensure that we don't allow Turkey to sideline the US or European allies, specifically in the counter-ISIS mission, because they don't have the capacity on their own to take over this mission. We also really need to encourage Turkey to work with our partners inside and outside the region. That means that there needs to be a discussion to disaggregate the SDF from the PKK, to focus on integrating the SDF into the new Syrian government in order to keep those skill sets. And then the third thing that we need to consider is our European allies, who we need their assistance in engaging the operational and financial parts of the counter-ISIS mission. Specifically, as Suhair was saying, our European allies have taken the lead on these negotiations, specifically the UK and France. And so there needs to be some sort of clarification on how they will help us as we are looking to have a lighter footprint. That means money. It means possibly soldiers. But it also means repatriating their citizens, which they have been long reluctant to do. And it also means, as we think about repatriation, we also need to think about funding for reintegration, which is a vital part of the counter-ISIS mission.
Really important points here on the way forward. One, clarify the U.S. vision of the end state for Damascus when it comes to the de-ISIS mission. Two, really focus in on the SDF-Damascus relationship as key for whether or not this mission and the U.S. role in the mission can be transitioned over any period of time. If that isn't working from both the Damascus side and the SDF side, very hard to see this through. 3, Turkey could play a spoiler role, could be very important, can't take over the entire mission. Hug Turkey close on this one. And 4, European allies. Long list here. What's the future military role? What's the future of the funding? What's the future on repatriating detainees and displaced people of European origin who still remain in Northeast Syria? Quite a task list, Dev. Thanks so much. Okay, David, take us home here. I want to zoom out for the final question for this round and could talk about what this change in US policy means for other partners going forward. We've spoken a lot about the European allies. You spoke at the beginning about our Gulf partners. Devora just spoke about Turkish interests. We haven't spoken yet about Israel and its policy on Syria, which is not really aligned with everything we've spent the past 45 minutes talking about in terms of a Arab, American, or European vision for the way forward on Syria. So talk to us about the view from Israel and anything else you'd like to say about the changing nature of US policy towards Syria in the context of the region.
So, thanks. When we look at Syria, the changes there, the changes in US policy, I think are going to have a profound impact. We'll get to Israel in a second, but of course, Jordan and Lebanon, the Dev spoke about repatriation from al-Hol. We can talk about repatriation of 1.5 million Syrians in Lebanon if this change in policy results in stabilization. 1 million potentially Syrian refugees in Jordan returning. There are implications for Iraq as well. Broader, if we move broader, obviously, this shift, Iran is not going to embrace the shift. They're not pleased with the Syrian or al-Sharaa détente with the Trump administration. It was bad enough that Tehran lost its 45-year strategic ally in the Assad regime. Now they're facing the prospect that al-Sharaa might succeed. If it had failed, right, it might have turned into a Libya, and allowing Iran the opportunity to get back in or resume its line of communication to Hezbollah. No such luck. Worse, I think, for Iran, the meeting raised al-Sharaa's stature, moving him potentially into not only the anti-jihad camp, but perhaps some sort of Western orientation. Russia, regional actor, was also not pleased. But the naval base at Tartus, the future of that is open. So is Himamim, the Air Force base, which was hit by drones of unknown origin on Tuesday. Likewise, al-Sharaa canceled the contract of a Russian firm, the STG engineering firm, to run Tartus and turned it over to Dubai Ports World. So to Israel now. Like Iran and Russia, Israel too is not pleased with the change in US policy. I think the government of Israel was in the camp of once a jihadi, always a jihadi. The government wanted the sanctions to continue, even if it undermined the chances for al-Sharaa to succeed. I think the government preferred a weak and or divided Syria to a unified, successful country. This shift, I think there's a concern potentially in Israel that the shift will somehow invest, as Suhair said, the United States more in Syria, and potentially with or without the whispering of Erdogan or Mohammed bin Salman, encourage the United States to move into a position that looks to limit or curtail ongoing Israeli military operations, expansive military operations in Syria, which many in the region view as destabilizing. I think it will also raise questions about what Israel's ultimate strategy is in Syria. I think for Israel, there are also concerns about the Turkish ascendancy in Syria. Dev talked about the Syria Working Group. That's Turkey and Washington. Israel has skin in the game. They're not invited to the conversation. So they're being left out. And of course, I think we can say at a minimum, Israel and Turkey are frenemies at worst. I think they could be seen as a hostile states. And worse than all of this, I think for Israel, and then the sort of recognition or lifting of sanctions was the fact that Israel was apparently not notified prior to the reversal in the U.S. approach. I think taken together, this change in U.S. policy, along with the Houthi ceasefire, where Israel was not notified beforehand nor included in the nature of the agreement, and the Idan Alexander hostage release, where Israel too was not notified. The Syria decision, I think, was a sort of sad trifecta for Israel, of the United States leaving Israel out of the loop. Israel wants to be on the same page with Washington, not to be notified essentially of what page to turn to after the page has been turned. I think there's an increasing concern in Israel about recent developments on this front and what it's going to mean going forward, especially vis-a-vis the Iran negotiations. Finally, Turkey is very pleased. This worked out great for them. Erdogan had phoned in to the meeting with Trump and al-Sharaa and Mohammed bin Salman, so he was at that meeting. Erdogan has solidified his role as the Trump whisperer. Ankara has more influence with Washington on Syria than Turkey's leading rival there, Israel. By convincing Trump to suspend the sanctions, Erdogan has further, likewise, endeared himself to al-Sharaa. So I think I have to think Turkey is really feeling very good about Trump's Gulf tour.
Trump whisperers in that camp: Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Turkey, others very pleased. I think very important that you underscored the implications for Jordan and Lebanon, who have hosted millions of Syrian refugees fleeing the violence of the Assad regime. Those not pleased with last week's developments: Iran, Russia, and Israel. Who is the odd man out in that category is clearly the U.S. ally and partner, Israel, who, as opposed to what the United States and its partners are now doing, which is working to strengthen the Sharaa government in Damascus, is still pursuing expansive military operations in Syria, absent articulating an Israeli strategy for what it's doing in Syria. And finally, you note the pattern of failing to notify Israel when Trump is making major decisions across all variety of issues in the Middle East that will have significant and immediate impact on Israel's security. Definitely areas to watch. We are going to finish this really enriching and in-depth discussion today by a few rapid fire questions. I'd like to close out where we began, which were the 5 President Trump requests to President Sharaa when he announced that he would lift sanctions on Syria. So I would like to start with your assessment in one sentence or less, the likelihood that Syria will sign on to the Abraham Accords and normalize relations with Israel. For this one, we'll start at this end, Sohair, and move down the line.
In my view, after Saudi Arabia.
After Saudi Arabia.
Not in the immediate future, but I think it could potentially be in the cards.
Medium term.
Long term, I think they're going to push it out until they can.
In the short term, al-Sharaa has concerns from his right. So I don't see this as something that's possible near term at all. Either in the long term or following Saudi Arabia, that is definitely possible.
It's political. Okay, next one. The likelihood that Damascus will act on President Trump's request to eject foreign fighters, or perhaps Matt's suggestion from earlier to give them nice farms to retire in Idlib. but the Trump request was to eject foreign fighters. Likelihood that Damascus can deliver. Matt.
I don't see them ejecting foreign fighters from the country. They could push some people out quietly, but the core request, and if you look different places, it appears different ways, wasn't necessarily to eject them from the country, but to kick them out of government positions. And that certainly can and should happen.
Echoing Matt's point on ejecting them from government, I also think that when we talk about foreign fighters, there's three groups. There's those associated with the new government, there's those associated with the PKK, which I think will be ejected, and those associated with ISIS, which I also think will be ejected.
It's going to be a long process. Al-Sharaa got where he is today because of these folks. And if he starts to take significant action on that front, which I think is unlikely, but if he takes it, I think he's got to worry about executive protection.
Long process. When he was in Paris, he got this question from a journalist, al-Sharaa himself. And what he said is, we have to go back to the constitution. And then depending on this new Syrian constitution, we'll see to what extent they can be granted nationality. So it gives a sense of this very long process and these answers that al-Sharaa will be giving concerning foreign fighters, I think.
Fascinating answer. It's complicated. Okay. Next one. The likelihood that Damascus will act on the request to deport Palestinian terrorists. Let's start at this end.
Likely.
Likely?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a low-hanging fruit. A big gift to the United States. Good for Sharaa, good for Syria, good for all involved.
Likely, easy win.
I think it's likely, but not immediate. And I think it's less easy, again, because of his perceived domestic politics. His regime has arrested one person with Palestinian Islamic Jihad, another with PFLP-GC. But according to some of the officials I've been meeting with, they might have been quickly released. And there are other more important people that were on the list, and they haven't been touched. So this is going to be a process, but one that I think ultimately, once he secures control, which he does not have right now, this is something he could do.
Next, the likelihood that Damascus can help in preventing an ISIS resurgence. Let's start on this side.
Look, when we give them intelligence on things right now, they act, and that's very much in their interest. But when it comes to dealing with the detainees, this is, I think, beyond their capability. So security in Syria, it's completely aligned interest, but asking them to be full partners and kind of dealing with the problem of the tens of thousands of people sitting in eastern Syria, I don't see them as being capable in the moment.
I do think that this is likely that they can help prevent the ISIS resurgence, but I think that it's also too narrow of an ask that we're giving them. So the ISIS insurgence is not necessarily my greatest fear at the moment. It's also other jihadist groups who might take advantage.
Listen, I think that ISIS poses a threat to the regime. I think where it poses a threat, it will act against it, but let's keep in mind, al-Sharaa can't even control a third of Syria so far. He's not going to be in position to really help on this front just yet.
On willingness, as we said, they're threatened themselves. Damascus is threatened by the Islamic State. So I think, yeah, strong willingness probably from Damascus to help. But then comes the question of the capabilities.
Thank you. Final Trump ask was to take over the detention facilities housing ISIS detainees. Likelihood that this will happen. Let's start on this side again, Matt.
Yeah, I incorporated that in my last answer. I don't see them being able or willing, or us trusting them to do it.
Not able anytime in the near term. The humanitarian crisis, as I mentioned in my talking points, is horrible. Many Syrians would rather stay in al-Hol, where they're at least getting services, than leave al-Hol. So taking that over is just nearly impossible at this current time, as well as the fact that the new regime is not working with the SDF the way they need to, and the SDF is the only one that has the capability to hold this at the moment.
Entirely dependent on the SDF.
Down the road.
Okay. Final bonus round. If the White House had called each of you before the president made his 5 requests, and you could add one thing to the list, what would it be, starting on this side? Sohair.
I would definitely add transitional justice because unfortunately, this is not the first post-war reconstruction process we're witnessing. And sometimes it's not taken into consideration at the very beginning of the process, but then it comes back.
I got two. First is boot Russia. You want money from the United States, you want sanctions relief. Russia's a bad actor. They shouldn't have bases in Syria anymore. Secondly, I would encourage the administration to ask the al-Sharaa government to reassert their historic claims to Sheba Farms, the piece of disputed territory that Israel now occupies in bordering with Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. If Syria reclaims that, we end the border dispute between Israel and Lebanon completely.
I would ask them to disaggregate the prisons and detention camps because they are different issues, different funding issues, different security issues.
I want to echo David's comment on the Sheba Farm. It's very important. I can't help but notice also that the Jordanians are still having to run operations across that border on a regular basis. And whereas the new regime is not running Captagon like the old regime did, they're clearly also not yet doing enough to stop those criminal enterprises, some tied to Iran across the border from Jordan that still are. And finally, and this might be the hardest, is I'd ask for them to seek a way to balance the relationship with Turkey, because to follow on David's remarks about Israel, I just came back from Israel. The Israelis have several concerns. Single most pressing is the concern that Turkey, which is increasingly aggressive to Israel as Israeli officials see it, is going to be very dominant in this country. And that alone could create a destabilizing factor. Even if everything else that we discussed here today is resolved, if that remains, we're going to have a problem.
Quite a long list of things missing from the list. Transitional justice, close down the Russian military base, resolve the status of Sheba Farms, add nuance into the ISIS detainees and displaced persons camp, take action on counter narcotics, balance foreign policy approaches with Turkey and others. And what none of you said was anything related to the style or inclusive nature of governance for this.
I did have it, but you told me one. That was my second point.
They all cheated and added too. Thank you all for sticking with us for this incredibly rich and detailed panel. If you liked and enjoyed and benefited from what you heard, I encourage you to sign up so you can tune into future policy forums here hosted by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Sign up for our listservs where you can receive a steady drumbeat of expert analysis put out by these fantastic scholars who continue to be the cutting edge of policy analysis here in Washington, D.C. Thank you again. And if you'd like to see another version of this later, it will be cached on our website, available also on YouTube.
Signing out.